Hello, my name is Bruce Caldwell. I'm the director of the Center for the History of Political Economy at Duke University, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this panel discussion on the future of liberalism. This discussion is sponsored by the Center and by the ARET initiative, which is part of the Keenan Institute for Ethics here at Duke. It's one of a planned 3 such panel discussions, the other 2 being on the futures of conservatism and of progressivism. We're fortunate indeed to have with us 4 leading scholars of liberalism. Emily Chamley Wright is the president and CEO of the Institute for Humane Studies, whose mission is to advance a deeper understanding of ideas in the classical liberal intellectual tradition. Emily has published 6 books in the area of liberal education, post-disaster recovery, and economic development. Her most recent work examines the ethical and cultural requirements of civil discourse in the academy and the broader civil society. Steve Davies is Education Director at the Institute of Economic Affairs in London. He is co-editor of the Dictionary of Conservative and Libertarian Thought, and among his other books are The Wealth Explosion, which looks at the nature and origins of modernity, The Economics and Politics of Brexit, which carries the subtitle The Realigning of British Public Life, and the wonderfully named Streetwise Guide to the Devil and His Works. Steve Horowitz is Distinguished Professor of Free Enterprise in the Department of Economics and Director of the Institute for the Study of Political Economy in the Miller School of Business at Ball State University. Horowitz is the author of 4 books and scores of articles in professional journals, and is a frequent guest commentator on radio and cable television programs. His research is focused on monetary theory and history, Austrian economics, the political economy of Friedrich Hayek, and American economic history. Finally, Chandran Kukathas is Dean of the School of Social Sciences at Singapore Management University, where he also holds the Lee Kong Chian Chair of Political Science. He received his DPhil in politics from Oxford University, where, and of course I had to mention this, he was co-founder of the Oxford Hayek Society. He's the author of Hayek and Modern Liberalism, Rawls, A Theory of Justice and Its Critics, that's co-authored with Philip Pettit, The Liberal Archipelago, A Theory of Diversity and Freedom, and most recently, Immigration and Freedom. I'm delighted to host this event. I'll begin by saying good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to our panelists. This is because they're coming from time zones across the globe. So let's get started. I'd like to start with just some basic questions. What is liberalism? What are its major tenets? How did it develop? Who were some of its major protagonists? We'd just try to give the audience some idea of what this body of doctrine might be. And Steve Davies, if you would you start us off?
Well, thanks very much, Bruce. And I suppose the way I would start in answer to the question, what is liberalism, is to say that it's something modern. There are people throughout history who you might think of as being proto-liberals. They articulate views and beliefs of a kind that would later become central parts of liberalism. And what that means, by the way, is that there is a liberal or proto-liberal tradition, if you will, in every part of the world. The idea that it comes ultimately from something distinct to one part of the world is not true. But it only exists as a self-aware political intellectual movement from the very last couple of decades of the 18th century. And the term itself only comes into use in the 1820s. So what I would argue is that, for example, people like John Locke should not really be understood as liberals. They're proto-liberals, but later liberals draw on them. So it's a modern phenomenon. It's a feature of the modern world. The central foundational ideas, I think, actually are 2. And the first is that the world, and the human world that is, can be improved and made better. That we as a species, if you like, do not have to accept the hand we're dealt by nature and brute circumstance, and that it is possible to improve the quality of human life, and above all else, to create a greater scope and variety of human flourishing and well-being. And that this is the end that we should direct our efforts towards. It's the end that institutions and other things should serve. And the second major foundational point, after that one about human improvement or amelioration, is the idea that there is no one perfect way for human beings to flourish, that there is no single definitive idea of what the good life is, that we should bend everything else towards realizing. In other words, there's an element of pluralism. And the final key ultimate component is the idea that what is both a necessary condition and arguably a sufficient condition for this enhanced human flourishing, the better human life, is liberty. Now, what then that leads to, of course, is a thing which divides many liberals as well as liberals from other people, which is what is liberty? And essentially, in its bare minimum, it means basically that people should be left alone as the default condition, unless they give you very, very good reasons for not doing this, that people should be left their own devices, that there should be mutual toleration and respect between people. In other words, the principle, if you like, of live and let live. And this sounds like a very simple principle, but of course, working it out in practice is extremely difficult. But also what the historical evidence shows is that that very simple principle is in fact, on all the evidence that we have, the key to a whole expanse of greater human flourishing, greater diversity of flourishing, greater self-realization, if you will. And it may be that it needs to be combined with other things, and I think most liberals will accept that it is, but it's certainly a necessary condition for achieving those two basic liberal goals of realizing a diversity of human flourishing and of improving the human world. So that's what I would say liberalism is, understood as a historical phenomenon.
Great. Chandran, could we hear from you next, please?
Yes, well, firstly, I agree with everything that Steve has to say, but I'm going to come at it from a slightly different angle in order to highlight a different aspect of what I see as the liberal tradition, which very much is something that I think comes to life in the late 18th and 19th centuries. And the way I would look at it would be to say that liberalism comes to life in opposition to three sources of power. And this is the critical thing I want to say about liberalism, that it's a doctrine that's extremely suspicious of power. I think in the first instance, it's suspicious of power of the church. Secondly, it's suspicious of the power of the state and aristocracy. And thirdly, it's extremely suspicious of the mercantile class. And we can see this most particularly, of course, in the work of Adam Smith, which despite his reputation as the father of modern economics and indeed of capitalism, was a huge critic of the mercantile class because he thought that they never got together except to conspire against the public. But the critical thing here, I think, is that what liberalism and liberals are suspicious of, I think, is power. Now, the problem then becomes what to do about it. Philosophically, it's led some liberals to an anarchistic sort of a position to suggest that there is no hope of ever establishing a form of power that was not subject to all of the weaknesses and problems of power. But there are also liberals in that same tradition who think that what we need, therefore, are institutions that are designed to try to contain power. Now, of course, the great dilemma here is that it's difficult to contain power without either establishing some higher power or giving other powers the capacity to check the power you're worrying about, but at the risk of those powers, in fact, growing greater. The power that liberals, I think, are most concerned about is the power of the state, not because it's the only power that can be damaging. Of course, economic power can be greatly damaging, as can the power of religion. But the state in modern times is peculiarly a concern because the modern state has, in fact, assumed a kind of power that was, in a sense, unknown in earlier times. In earlier times, for example, if you think about the Roman emperors and the vast power that they wielded, Alexis de Tocqueville makes this point, that power weighed prodigiously on a few, in Tocqueville's words, but for the great bulk of human society, the emperor had no capacity to exert any power. They were simply too remote. It's the nobles the aristocrats over whom the emperor had power. Well, in the modern state, it's really quite different. The modern state has a capacity to reach deeply into every aspect of human life. It was beginning by the time of the emergence of the modern state in the 19th century, and it has grown enormously since then. So I think liberals, and classical liberals in particular, are concerned about this particular power in particular. Now, of course, there are questions to be asked about the moral values that underpin this attitude, and I think here Steve has given us a pretty good account of what these values are. The only thing I would add is that in terms of modern liberalism, although he's quite right to say that we find elements of what he's called proto-liberalism in different traditions in all parts of the world, I think modern liberalism is a distinctively Western and Christian phenomenon insofar as most of the ideas that have developed and have been articulated in modern political theory about liberalism that goes by that name, comes out of certain convictions that arise out of Christianity. Firstly, and most importantly, I think the equality of all persons under God and the directness of their relationship with God. And ultimately, I think it comes out of the developments in Christianity and in Christian politics in the 16th and 17th century, when people came to see that trying to establish the correct view of Christianity was essentially implausible, and came to accept a kind of view that we should try to tolerate one another, accept that we have different understandings of God, different approaches to what is the correct way to live, and should live in a world of mutual toleration. We've gone back and forth on this, and sometimes these principles have been more honored in the breach than in the observance. But I think that's still very much at the core of liberalism.
Okay. Emily, we'll turn to you now.
Thanks, Bruce, and thank you for allowing me to be a part of this panel and in such distinguished company. Thank you for that opportunity. I agree with Chandran and with Steve that liberalism is a moral and philosophical system. It's based on an abiding respect for the individual. It's that deep commitment to this idea that we are one another's dignified equals. This is a radical idea, but it becomes commonplace within a liberal order, and that's an exciting evolution in human history. It tries to also identify the institutions and operating principles whereby an emancipated people can engage in self-governance, and including restraining power. So I agree with all of that. And in addition, though, I think that one of the things that distinguishes the liberal project is a certain set of liberal sensibilities that support the ideal of the good society. And by that, I mean a pluralistic society in which individuals and communities flourish in a context of peaceful and productive cooperation rather than violence. And so what are some of these norms and sensibilities that are part of the liberal project? You know, when you think about what is both the foundation and a reinforcing principle of liberalism, a couple of things spring to mind, some of which have already been described, which is a baseline default of tolerance, that we can be different, we can worship in different places, we can exercise different forms of the good life, as long as we're not violating one another's individual liberties, though we can have mutual forbearance, and we can tolerate one another. And this requires that we avoid a sort of impulse to interfere with one another through our meddlesome preferences. If you think about the app next door, I wonder sometimes I look at it and see it as a liberalism enhancing device, because it allows us to engage in a kind of bottom-up self-governance, and other times it allows us to engage in a lot of invasive meddlesome exercising our meddlesome preferences. I think another example of a kind of cultural sensibility of liberalism is a willingness to go with the whirlwind of disruption and change. And that's hard because we are biologically hardwired not to like uncertainty and not to like change. And it doesn't matter whether the change is coming from an economic or a cultural source. The lesson that order will spontaneously reemerge. Now that's a liberal lesson, but it can be really counterintuitive. You know, when the ancients saw order, they saw God at work. When the modern sees order, we often see a rational or engineer's mind at work, which is understandable because we have the experience of applying critical reason to complex problems. And when we do, we often find solutions. Even, you know, and Hayek even said that it's absurd that to many of us, that when we think about the most complex problem of all, which is coordination across an expanded great order of society, the idea that that order emerges without the benefit of human design just is completely counterintuitive. So maintaining a mindset of optimism and resilience in the face of disruption and uncertainty, it can be emotionally, psychologically, intellectually really challenging. But getting these liberal sensibilities right is important to sustaining the liberal order and the liberal project. Otherwise, what we do is we tend to default to top-down solutions in a context of concentrated authority and power and control. So getting these elements of the cultural piece of liberalism, I think, is also important to getting those institutional and moral commitments right as well.
Thank you. Thank you. Steve Horowitz, would you like?
Well, following these three on this is difficult.
Yes.
And let me say, everything that they've said, I love, I think is right. So I'm going to try to maybe add a couple of layers to some things. First of all, I think that seeing liberalism as in opposition to power is particularly important. And I might spin it slightly differently and say the history of liberalism is also a history of objection to privilege. And as privilege was understood historically as particularly being state granted privilege and privileges that favored some people over another. We can certainly, I'm going to guess, talk more about that as we go along today, but I think that's really important too, to understand that the objection to privilege was the flip side of the sort of idea of dignified equals, or what some have called analytical egalitarianism, that we are all equal, we are all the same. And of course, historically, liberalism in practice didn't always live up to that. But it was certainly deep in the ideals. And one of the great things I think about how the liberal order has unfolded in the last couple of centuries is that we have slowly lived up to that promise in a number of ways. I also think Steve Davies' point about liberalism being particularly modern is important too. And part to me of that modernism, and it ties to something Emily said, is that we're living in this, what Hayek called the Great Society, in a world of anonymity, where most of the people we interact with, we don't know. And liberalism provides us with a way to engage in cooperation with anonymous others. And certainly this is a major theme of Hayek's work, and the idea that the liberal order is connected by means and not by ends, that we don't have a singular goal for society. Rather, we have a set of rules of just conduct, to use his phrase, but a set of rules and institutions that enable us to know what we can do and what we can't do. And when within the structure of those rules, we get, as Emily said, the emergence of order in all kinds of ways that we didn't design, and in ways that enhance peace and prosperity and progress. So I think understanding liberalism as a way, as a political philosophy particularly for the modern era, for an era in which we are not in small groups, we don't know everybody in a face-to-face family-like way. How do we come to live together? How do we engage in that cooperation and anonymity, I think, is a key question that liberalism comes to answer. And the pluralism and the openness to experimentation that characterize liberalism, I think, are part of that as well. That liberalism ultimately is a humble creed. We don't have all the answers. We don't know the right way to worship God. We recognize that people have to sort these things out for themselves, but they have to find a way to do it that respects the equal right of others to do the same. And I think that idea is really at the core of the history of liberalism.
Great. Okay, well, all of this sounds very good, and yet you will be surprised to find that not everyone appreciates liberalism. Indeed, it's a doctrine that is been everywhere under attack, it seems, and from a variety of different directions. Certainly, historically, liberalism has been juxtaposed to socialism, so socialists typically are not great appreciators of liberalism. More recently, critics of what's often dubbed neoliberalism, and it's never really clear to me exactly what that phrase means, but it seems to be associated with deregulation, free markets, globalization, open borders. And it's been blamed for, in various literatures, for a variety of woes of the last 20 or 30 years. Everything from the Iraq War to the 2008-2010 financial meltdown, the celebration and elevation of Wall Street over Main Street, that is to say, financial and corporate interest over those of the common person, the hollowing out of the middle class, the rise of the 1%, all of these sorts of sound bites are descriptive of events or things that are then associated with neoliberalism. Of course, this has given rise to populist movements, both in America and abroad, often particularly in terms of worries about immigration. Now, on the right, there have been conservative criticisms of and I shouldn't say right and conservative, but those kind of distinctions are not necessarily accurate, but conservative criticisms of liberalism are also rife. The perception of the elevation of the individual and of liberty comes at the cost of valuing your community, your country, your family, perhaps. And certainly the idea that traditional moral and religious values take second place to just this rampant individualism. So if I was to use a phrase that is perhaps a bit of hyperbole, a replacement of all these good things with rampant consumerism, heedless materialism, and godless, rootless cosmopolitanism. Okay, this sounds like it's hyperbole, but indeed, these sorts of claims have been made not only recently, but well into the past of liberalism as well. So I thought it would be good, before we move on to some of the insights that liberalism might give us, is to ask each of you to respond generally to one of these complaints. I'll ask a question that is a prompt to you, but then you should feel free to go wherever your discussion takes you. Steve Davies, let's start with you. So what is neoliberalism? Is it the same as liberalism? How might a liberal respond to some of the charges that are made by critics of neoliberalism?
Well, as you indicated there, Bruce, liberalism is getting lots of brickbats at the moment from both left and right. And what I would say is that the term neoliberalism is a critical label that comes mainly from the egalitarian left. I think it's interesting, and I'll return to this, that the conservative or right-wing critics of liberalism, people like Patrick Deneen, for example, or over here in Europe, people like the Rassemblement National and Marine Le Pen, they tend to be much more all-embracing. As far as they're concerned, the conservative critics, it's liberalism to core, which is in charge. The implication of that is that the egalitarian critics are attacking a particular variety or variant of liberalism. It's worth bearing that in mind. I think the term neoliberalism actually has two quite distinct meanings. One of them is the meaning it has in what you might call its journalistic popular sense, where it's a kind of catch-all term, which means something like free market economics, or even more generally, just stuff I don't like. And it's one of those terms that's actually intended to tell you more about the person using it than it is about the referent. It's meant to tell you that the person using it is someone of a broadly egalitarian left-wing sensibility who doesn't like the economic and political status quo and wants to change it in an egalitarian direction. So it's a kind of badge. I would add, by the way, that the term cultural Marxism serves a similar purpose for people on the political right. It's a way of telling the hearer that they don't like the current cultural climate, and they want to change that in a certain direction. So I think in that sense, it's not got a great deal of intellectual content, unless you accept an underlying premise that free market economics almost always bad. It does, however, to be fair, have a more precise intellectual meaning. And I think this meaning has become fleshed out and solidified really in the last 5 to 7 or 8 years. And what that refers to is a particular turn in public policy, which took place really in the second George Bush and Bill Clinton's period in the United States, or in the John Major administration and then the new Labour administration in the United Kingdom. And neoliberalism in this more precise sense refers to essentially the extension of market mechanisms into the public domain, into areas such as education, health provision in the UK, which were thought of previously as being not part of the realm of markets provision and supply, along with a number of associated values, supposedly individualism and like. And I think more broadly what it refers to in this precise sense is a species of technocratic economic management, which employs a series of, if you like, intellectual toolkits derived ultimately from neoclassical mainstream economics of a certain type. Now, what connection is there between neoliberalism in this precise sense and liberalism more broadly defined? There is a connection, but I do think that actually that connection is not quite as strong as many people suppose on all parts of the spectrum, because what you're talking here about essentially is a species of technocratic political management, management by an elite, which happens to use free market tools or instruments. But the point is they're understood as being precisely that, tools or instruments, rather than as being an aspect of the working of a free society. And that's a crucial difference, it seems to me, because the general liberal approach, which you heard from the other 3 people here as well as myself, is that if you leave people to their own devices, you will have a spontaneous order, you will have human flourishing. And from that perspective, free markets, free economic exchange and trade, these are all parts of that spontaneous order. They're what also help to create it. Whereas this neoliberal approach, which I think I would be actually quite critical of in some respects, is one which thinks that this is a kind of toolkit that administrators and politicians can draw upon and plug in to address or resolve issues in maybe the running of the public domain, the running of public institutions and the like. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, because it's prone to the same weaknesses and failures as any kind of technocratic top-down management. And so I think that, yes, the first sort of journalistic use of the term, really, I think it's more a matter of political rhetoric. It's interesting to study as an example of how political rhetoric works, but it doesn't have a substantive intellectual content. In this second sense, I think it does have a substantive intellectual content, but a rather precise one, and it's quite important to be clear about what it is. And I think you can have quite a useful engagement actually with the people who use it in that sense as to what exactly it is that they don't like about it, and why they think it's so damaging. Finally, though, some of the people who use it in that more precise sense also mean by it things which they think are connected to that technocratic management, which they also don't like. And you alluded to one of them, which is so-called financialization. The growth in the size and importance of the financial services sector within the overall economy, and secondly, globalization and increased economic integration on the planet. And I think, therefore, in those areas, there's a case for a much more straightforward and robust argument about arguing that these two things are actually broadly beneficial for the human condition, even though there may be problems with the precise form they've taken at the margin, that there's something actually broadly good about them.
Very good, thanks. Okay, I'm going to turn to Emily next. Emily, one way that critics draw a distinction between liberalism and progressivism is over questions of social justice. Liberals care about individuals, as we've heard, whereas progressives care about justice for groups that have been ill-treated in the societies in which they live. Is this a fair characterization? Do liberals not care about social justice? How might liberals respond to this claim?
Yeah, I think one way in which liberals have responded is to do deep philosophical work around this distinction between individual rights and group rights. But I'm going to set that aside for a moment to identify first what we might see as a common concern, and then ask the question, are liberal principles up to the task of addressing that concern? So, for example, I think both liberals and progressives care about unequal treatment under the law, mass incarceration, over-policing of communities of colors and communities of color and issues along these lines, both and scholars as well as citizens across the ideological spectrum care about these concerns. So then I would turn the question to liberalism: are liberal principles up to the task of addressing concerns like these? And I think to do that work intellectually, to do that work well, if we're not hitting the mark of the good society, if everyone's liberty is not being respected, then we need a clear diagnostic set of categories, right? So one category, I see at least 3 diagnostic categories. One category is that liberalism itself has failed, that liberalism is not up to the task of addressing a particular concern. And then if that's the case, the argument has to be made. What is it about liberalism that has failed in that particular case? Another category of concern, another category when we see that something's amiss, something's wrong, is that liberal principles have just not been consistently applied, right? That's a different thing. That's a different kind of problem and probably will require a different sort of solution. And then there's a third category that's not necessarily one or the other. It's that some law or public policy that is couched in liberal language, couched in language that's quote unquote objective or neutral, right? It's not supposed to have a systematically disproportionate burden shared by one group or another, but in fact seems to have that connection, that there's some public policy that it looks on the surface to be liberal, but in actual effect, it produces a disproportionate burden on some minority oppressed group. Now, if it's this latter category, then we need to ask the question, is there a fix? Is there a way to have a reform that makes the public policy or the law more politically, economically, culturally neutral in this sense, that it doesn't pre-select some group to share a disproportionate burden? You know, that's hard work. But one of the things that I hear, for example, in the challenges issued by the Black Lives Matter movement, now one can identify that set of concerns and that set of solutions that are being proposed as an appeal to group rights. But if you unpack it, I think more often than not, it's true that there are some versions of the Black Lives Matter critique that look more like a pro-group rights sort of position. But I think far more common is that the concern is that there's an inconsistent application of liberal principles at work. And so the solution to the problems are really found within liberal democratic principles that we see within the Declaration of Independence, for example, and the Bill of Rights. It doesn't mean that there isn't a lot of hard work to be done. If you want to reverse and course correct bad policy, something like qualified immunity for police, that is arguably a difference of protection under the law, and it puts some people above the law. This would still be hard work, of course. But in that journey, we need a compass. What would be our compass? It would be liberal principles would be our compass on that journey. And I'll say just one more thing in this context, and that's that again, setting the more refined scholarly critiques of liberalism aside for the moment, when most people express outrage at some injustice, it's basic liberal principles that are serving as their compass that's guiding their moral intuition. And the problem, though, is that I think that many of us have lost the language of liberalism. And by that, I don't mean that everyone needs to go get a PhD in political theory, for example. It's that sort of basic 11th grade civics class awareness that we do have this compass. It's called liberalism, but we have this compass. It's an instrument that we need to pull out of our pocket, dust off, And this is a kind of instrument that improves with more use. And that's where I think we are in society at the moment. It's not that liberalism has failed as much as we have forgotten that we've got this really valuable instrument that points us in the right direction.
Thank you very much, Emily. Steve Horwitz, one of your books carries the title Hayek's Modern Family, Classical Liberalism and the Evolution of Social Institutions. So I thought you would be a good person to try to respond to some of the claims that conservatives make about the emptiness of liberalism. So go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Bruce. I think we have to start by sort of saying there's two kinds of conservative critics these days. If you'd asked me this question 10 years ago, I would have talked about the first alone, which are sort of the social conservatives, for lack of a better term. But now we have this sort of economic nationalism argument that has come up and is beginning to dominate some ways on the right, certainly in the United States. So I want to talk about them separately in a minute. But first, I want to say I think that the liberal response to both of them at the broadest level is the same. And that's something like the following. And any attempt, the problem with conservatism is that it attempts often to freeze in place the status quo. And that deprives us of the ability to discover new and better ways of doing things. The liberal tradition, I think Emily said this earlier, has always been not just open to, but strongly supportive of the importance of evolution and change and of learning in all of those ways. We have a long tradition from Mill and before Mill, I think, but certainly from Mill with the idea of experiments in living, which I think is a phrase that has much broader application than it sometimes is used. And the 20th century, we have Hayek talking about the idea of markets as discovery processes, and the liberal tradition emphasizing historically the idea that human beings have limited knowledge, and that one of the challenges that we face is figuring out, again, how to make that knowledge available to others, how to learn from each other, and how to find better ways of doing things. And in many ways, these sort of define the liberal worldview. We don't and we can't know what things are best. And when we give people freedom in both the economic and the social realm in order to find out what works and what doesn't. Hayek called this the fatal conceit or the pretense of knowledge, but certainly it's present, I think, in a lot of the liberal tradition. It's also, and I think, again, Emily said this early on as well, there's a kind of confidence within liberalism about the future and about our ability to adjust and be resilient. And I think that sort of gestalt, that kind of set of values underpins the liberal response to conservatism. So I'll mention kind of two particular kinds of issues real quick. One, the relationship between liberalism and tradition. And I think there's a whole deep discussion to have here about this. But the way I would frame it is that liberalism is respectful of tradition, but not reverent about it. Liberals, particularly ones influenced by Hayek, would agree with conservatives that we can't construct the world according to our wishes, as some on the left seem to think. But unlike conservatives, liberals don't think that recognizing the wisdom of tradition means ossification. After all, our current things that we call traditions were once radical new ideas. We need to leave room for experimentation that improves institutions and enhances freedom. You mentioned my book on the family, and one of the interesting sort of core stories in that book is the evolution of marriage. And we sort of treat marriage, the kind of 20th century version of the quote traditional marriage, as if it's been around forever. But we know historically that's a peculiarly 20th century phenomenon. I would note, by the way, a peculiarly liberal phenomenon as well. And if we look at the history of marriage, it has evolved and changed over time. And to try to say something is traditional or something is the thing we need to preserve sort of at all costs is ultimately ahistorical and ultimately deprives us of the ability of finding new kinds of arrangements that are appropriate at particular times. As for the economic nationalists and some of their concerns, I think one of the concerns in that group, again, an overarching concern, is community and the role of community. And it's true that liberalism involves oftentimes very fast economic and social change that can quickly change the well-being and the demographics of individuals and the demographics of a variety of communities. I think that the sense that many perhaps people have that they no longer live in the community or in the nation that they thought they did, it drives a lot of this conservative critique. And no doubt, I think, for liberals, it is a challenging idea, and the response to this is an important challenge. But I think it's worth pointing out that liberalism does two important things as part of these broader processes of dynamic change that liberalism involves. One, it does in fact create materially better lives for more and more people. And materially, when people live better materially, that enables them to respond better to non-material challenges. We get more education, we have better medical care, we have all of these sort of things that improve us in a whole variety of ways and make us more resilient when the time for change arrives. It's important to remember that as devastating as economic competition can be, it's not the same as biological competition, right? We have ways of ensuring that people who are on the short end of the stick economically nonetheless still survive. The debate in liberalism these days over the idea of universal basic income, for example, is a good example of that. It also, liberalism and the processes it involves, enables people to form various what we might call Tocquevillian associations as ways to help those who need it. Liberalism provides both the means and the freedom to find ways to help. And we oftentimes, and liberals, I think, have sometimes ignored the lessons from Tocqueville and ignored the importance of the institutions of civil society. For much of the 20th century, the debate was market or state, for perhaps obvious reasons. But socialism in that sense, at least, is gone now, or mostly. And the question of those third institutions of civil society and the role that churches and synagogues and mosques, the role that other forms of community help play, I think is really important. And liberals need to develop more clarity, I think, about how those institutions play as a response to the conservative critics on the economic side. I think what we can say, what liberals have said, is that the state or communities in partnership with the state don't tend to do this very well, to respond to change, to help people who need it. And so we have to go back to thinking from the bottom up about how communities can do this. And last thing I'll say is that the sort of economic nationalism that is beginning to be identified with the political right, with conservatism, has historically not helped people. It has led to impoverishment. It's led to conflict. Limiting the ability to trade limits our ability to construct peaceful relationships with others, to grow and to progress. And those relationships, those mutual independencies, are part of the way in which liberalism promotes peace. The tolerance we've been speaking of has to extend to the economic realm as well.
Thank you very much. Chandran, opposition to immigration has played a role in the election of Donald Trump, the success of Brexit, and also has fueled various nationalist movements across Europe. You've just published a book on immigration and freedom. I wonder if you would share some insights that come from the liberal mindset about the role of immigration and whether it's the danger that is so often feared.
Yeah, I'd be glad to. The key thought in the book, in a way, is somewhat obvious. What I want to say is that people are often very concerned about immigration because they're concerned about the impact of an influx of people, whether into their communities or their provinces or their states, as in their nations. But what has often been overlooked, I think, is the extent to which immigration control is actually as serious, if not more serious, a problem. Because in order to address these concerns that people have about the influx of immigrants, what has to be done is that controls have to be established in order to limit the movement of people and to manage the way in which people interact. Now, one of the reasons why I think this is a somewhat obvious thing is that a little reflection should tell us that in any country, what we'll find is not a wholesale opposition to immigration, but in fact disagreement among people in the population about the extent to which they would like to see immigration. And there's not only disagreement about the abstract question, should we have so many more immigrants or so many fewer immigrants? There's also a disagreement to the extent that some people simply disagree because they want particular people to join them within the society. Employers want workers, members of a church may want like-minded people to join their community. universities want to welcome scholars and students. Communities want to welcome those who are either related to them or share their way of life. There are so many ways that people want people to come in. So the debate about immigration is not actually a debate between natives and immigrants. It's really a debate amongst natives, or if you like, fellow nationals, some of whom want particular people to come in and others of whom don't. So any decision that's taken about immigration actually means saying to your fellow citizen, you may not associate with people as you see fit or as you would like. You cannot welcome people into your neighborhood or into your home as you would like, because I or we, or even a majority says this is not permissible. Now, why a majority should be able to say that to you, why, for example, the majority should be able to say to you who you should employ, why they should have any say in this at all is, from a liberal point of view, very peculiar. You wouldn't think that people would have this right when it comes to, say, your religious preferences, your marital preferences, your choice of school. Why should they have a say in your choice of employee, for example, or your choice of who to welcome into your home? You might understand this if people said, I don't want to welcome someone into my home. That's fine, you don't have to. But from a liberal point of view, why do you have any claim to prevent people from coming in and associating with you? So I think this is, in a way, it's a fairly obvious intuition, but it disappears in the course of the discussion of immigration. But there's another aspect to this, which is also, I think, worth bringing out. In all of this, what is assumed is that we actually have a pretty clear understanding of what is an insider and what is an outsider, what is a native, what is a foreigner, who is a national, who is a would-be immigrant. But all these categories are themselves simply a matter of definition. People have from time to time made rules, or their masters, their rulers, their political representatives have made rules determining who is or who is not a national. But there's nothing natural about this. Let me give you a couple of examples of this. Think, for example, of the British Empire. At the middle of the last century, Britain had about, by some estimates, 400 million nationals. By others, a figure presented by no less than Enoch Powell, the British minister who came to fame in the mid-1960s for his anti-immigration stance. He himself said that at that time, there were about 800 million Britons in the world, because Britain had an empire, and everyone in that empire was a subject of the crown and had full rights to travel within the empire and the right of residence within the United Kingdom. When people from the West Indies moved to the United Kingdom, they didn't move there as foreigners, they moved there as British subjects. They were British nationals. Now, over the next 40 years, legislation slowly took away the nationalities of different people until they could no longer just move freely as nationals, but had to now apply to move as immigrants. And my point here is that the first step in immigration control is not actually deciding to close the borders to immigrants. The first step is to decide who is a national and who is an immigrant. Now, I'm giving you this example from Britain, but I could say exactly the same about the United States, which has had long histories of debates about who could count as an American. For a long time, in order to be an American, you had to be white. But that meant there were long debates, Supreme Court cases, about who counted as white. For example, were people in the Middle East white? Were Indians white? At one point, the Supreme Court decided that Parsis were not, were white, but Punjabis were not white. All of which illustrates the extraordinarily arbitrary nature of these determinations. Mexicans come under a very, very similar situation. There were times when they were excluded on the basis of their cultural difference. but then also included when parts of Mexico were incorporated into the United States, and those Mexicans who were now American had to be classified as white because the law said in order to be an American, you have to be white. It was a kind of modus tollens. You are here, you are a citizen, so therefore you are white. In a way, what all of this is illustrating is something that's very much under-remarked upon in the whole debate about immigration. We just assume that there is a category of people who have the right of abode, or have the right of citizenship, or have the right of residence, and then there are others who have to apply for this. And there is a determinate way of concluding that some people have that right and others don't. But in fact, what we have is a political process in which people who are themselves already recognized as nationals or natives conflict or quarrel among themselves as to who to let in. And who is let in or who is not is really ultimately a reflection of the success or otherwise of some groups within society. Now, there's much more to be said about immigration from other perspectives, and I do try to address a number of them, because there are numerous objections to the kind of view that I've put that says, well, that may all very well be true. It may be that immigration controls do impinge upon individual freedom, but maybe it's worth it for economic gains or for cultural stability or for the fact that we have the right to determine for ourselves the future. And I try to address all of these questions in the second part of my book, but I think suffice it to say for the moment that I don't think any of these arguments ultimately are going to stand up. The economic case is especially weak. The cultural case is difficult to make because it assumes that there is, in fact, a kind of cultural homogeneity in a society. But what we see, in fact, is conflict among different groups, either for their own cultural integrity or to assert that there is a common cultural position, which in fact the very conflict reveals does not exist. And finally, the argument from self-determination is very difficult to sustain once one recognizes that immigration control is actually not a simple national determination. Immigration control is now an international regime. It involves treaties with different countries. It involves laws that cross boundaries. It requires that states agree with one another before one state can deport a person to another. So the idea that you're somehow going to take back control by controlling immigration is simply a myth. It's just not the case at all. What it does, in fact, is give certain people within political authority enormous amounts of power to determine how other people should live, and therefore also how you yourself should live.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that, Chandra. Well, the panel is about the future of liberalism. And at the very end, I will give you a chance, each of you, to shed your ideas on that. But right now, what I'd like to do is to address another question. I'd like to have each of you reflect on what liberalism would bring to some sort of issue of importance today in the news, in debates, policy debates, etc. And I'll just let you go. I didn't try to distinguish which particular views you should take. You just leaving it up to you to make that decision on your own. Very liberal approach, I suppose. Steve Horowitz, we'll start with you.
So I want to talk a little bit about inequality. And I think this is an issue, a core issue for critics of liberalism from the left, and to some degree increasingly from the right. And I want to talk a bit about how liberals might deal with this issue and respond to some of those criticisms. Let's start with an obvious thing. Liberals do care about inequality. You're waiting for it. But here's the but. The but is what matters, I think, to liberals is more about the process by which income and wealth are created and produced rather than the fact of inequality per se. And as related to that, I think historically liberals have cared much more about poverty and about helping the least well off than about inequality per se. And I want to keep emphasizing the per se part of that. For liberals, I think, their concern about inequality is tied up with that longstanding objection to privilege, and the one that we find in Adam Smith, in Mill, and Hayek, and throughout the liberal tradition. It's not a coincidence, for example, that Smith was very focused on improving the lives of the poor and had all of these strong objections to this notion of privilege. So one way to think about this, and one way that many liberals, modern liberals, have gone after this, is to distinguish between what we might call benign inequality and problematic inequality. The simple version is if people are getting really rich by providing value to others through the market, we all benefit from that. There's a very famous study by William Nordhaus that indicates that the creators of new ideas, of new products, only keep about 2% of the total benefits they create society-wide. The rest goes to the rest of us. And so there is, in their accumulation of wealth, there's also a win for the rest of us. And the sort of activities in the marketplace that might generate inequality are win-win activities. It's true that some people get very rich oftentimes, but they do so by providing things that we use and value. The role of Amazon in the pandemic is the one people point to these days, but there's certainly many others. It's also worth noting that some of what we measure as inequality is demographic. For example, increases in divorce take one wealthy household and make two poorer ones out of them. And that's going to measure as an increase in inequality. The question is that what we're really concerned about here? And new immigrants, of course, tend to come in toward the bottom of the income distribution. They will pull down things like the median household income. But again, if that increase in inequality a problem, especially if no one in the country being immigrated to is made worse off, and that the immigrants are made much better off by moving to, say, the United States from wherever they were. But there is some inequality, I think, that is problematic. And I think liberals need liberals have and need to continue to talk about this. And then that's, again, wealth that comes from government dispensed privileges. That process is not positive sum. In fact, it's negative sum. When we account for all the costs that people expend trying to obtain those monopoly privileges from various levels of government, the resources devoted to that are all wasteful. And in fact, those privileges, when we think about things like occupational licensure, monopoly contracts, lobbyists writing regulations that favor one set of firms over another, that all of those things, I think, need to be challenged, and liberals have challenged. And I think that liberals can join in progressive critics by saying that these are important sources of inequality and ones that we find to be problematic. I would include, by the way, antitrust on that list of things that might generate inequality, as incumbent firms often use it to protect themselves from new upstarts. This kind of concern with sort of privilege-driven inequality should be the sort of modern version of that longstanding liberal critique of privilege. And again, it's not inequality per se. That's the problem. It's the inequality that comes from those privileges. Many on the left worry also about inequality, about wealth accumulation and inequality translating into political power. And I think that's a legitimate concern, and we certainly see it. But that doesn't mean that the only solution is to sort of redistribute away from the rich. In fact, liberalism's desire to reduce the scope of political power would reduce the ability of those with wealth to obtain and abuse that political power. Let me just mention sort of 2 or 3 quick inequality related things that I think liberals are concerned with too. One is the question of income mobility. It's really important to remember that who is rich and who is poor is not the same every year. It's true that income mobility has dropped some over the last 20 or 30 years, but the United States, at least, in Canada, as far as I know the data, are still societies in which upward mobility is possible, very possible, and one in which downward mobility happens too. We tend to forget that the folks who are on top one year may not be there next year. One need only look at what the top 100 firms or 500 firms were in the United States 10, 20, 30, 40 years ago and today, and you can see that mobility. Rising inequality, increases in inequality are completely compatible with enriching the poor in a liberal society. And it may well be that the same processes that produce this inequality are the ones that make life better for the least well off. And then we have to think about what what that means and how we ensure that those who are gaining wealth through that growth and inequality are not able to turn that again into political power. Finally, as Nozick said, liberty upsets patterns, and I think that when we try to impose and pre-order distributions of wealth and income on people, it will mean very strong restrictions on their freedom. And in fact, I would argue people will find ways around those restrictions, and we will continue to reproduce the patterns of changes in income mobility that have always been the case. We're just going to do it with a sort of heavier rock around our neck that makes it harder to generate wealth for everyone. So I think that liberalism is concerned with inequality, but the inequality, again, that comes from privilege. I think liberals are less concerned with inequality that's part of the generalized process of economic growth, particularly in this sort of in a Rawlsian way, when it benefits the least well-off. And so there are ways in which liberals do care about inequality, but I do think it's true that the concern, and this is often confused in modern debates, whether we're talking about inequality or are we talking about poverty? For liberals, the concern with relieving poverty and the ways in which liberalism historically has improved the lives of the global poor, I think is a really important concern in the story that liberals like to tell.
Great. Steve Davies, can we hear from you next?
Okay, I might try and be greedy here and get a couple of things in. One of them is international relations and the whole question of the international order as such. Because I think at the moment we're at a point of great challenge for liberals, as indeed for people from other political traditions in this regard. Because since the end of World War II, we've seen the gradual emergence of a system of international relations and rules and institutions governing things like migration, as Chandran said, but also trade, capital flows and the like, and also relations between states, which has gradually built up. And the aim has been, since the creation of GATT and the United Nations, to create a rule-governed international order. And this was in response to the breakdown of the 19th century international order in the Great War and the chaos of the interwar years. And unfortunately, I think that order, if you like, has been pushed beyond a point of political acceptability, because what it has involved increasingly is taking large areas of what people regard as appropriate subjects for public policy out of the scope of democratic public policy and reserving them to essentially technocratic managerial elites. And we're now seeing an enormous pushback against this. In addition, I think there's the straightforward reality of geopolitical developments, which means that the basis on which that rule-bound system based, which was, to be blunt about it, the global preeminence of the United States, formerly rivaled by the Soviet Union since 1989 on its own, is basically coming to an end. And so the question is, what should liberals do about this? And now my own take on this is that actually there isn't a simple or straightforward answer to this, and that what liberals need to do, I think, is to bring to bear the political virtue of prudence on the one hand, but also idealism on the other. And I think that at the level of government-to-government relations, IR strictly understood, what most liberals should realistically aim for, I think, is to pursue the goals of traditional foreign policy realism. My own sort of view, to put it slightly flippantly, is that if you're engaged in the business of foreign policy, you should wear a little bracelet around your wrist which has on it WWBD, what would Bismarck do? Because I would far rather have foreign policy run by hard-headed, cynical realists like Bismarck or Talleyrand or Metternich or Salisbury than by starry-eyed idealists, because it's the second kind of people who tend to start major wars, actually, as opposed to people of the Bismarck type. And I think that there is actually an opportunity to create a realist-based, more stable international order, a multipolar one, maybe perhaps on a global scale, something like the Concert of Europe that was established at the Congress of Vienna in 1815, which actually worked very well for at least the next 50 years, maybe even until 1914, arguably. But on the other hand, that's not all it should be, because I'm not saying that liberals should accept that, because that involves accepting, as a matter of realpolitik, all kinds of things that liberals will find unacceptable, such as the way in which certain great powers behave very badly. The other side of the equation, I think, is the strategy of civil society, of people's diplomacy, as 19th century liberals used to call it, which is the idea of building up and strengthening direct person-to-person relationships across geopolitical borders at the level of civil society, partly through the simple medium of economic exchange and trade, but also through other things such as forms of personal relationship, friendship, contacts, and also direct political contacts and connections. And this, it seems to me, is the way to, as you say in the United States, do an end run around the kind of constraints that sovereign governments may seek to put upon ideas and cultural and other influences from other parts of the world in order to preserve their own privileged position, but very often in ways that liberals will deeply dislike and find threatening. So I would argue that we are coming to the end, really, of an era of international relations, which you can date back perhaps to 1948. And I think that really that era is clearly breaking down. And so it's a very pressing question, not just for liberals, but for all of us, actually, as to what kind of world we move into. And my answer would be that as liberals, you should support a rather hard-headed realist approach at the level of government-to-government relations, but you should also support at the same time, on classic Cobdenite grounds, actually, a major deepening and strengthening of people's diplomacy and of civil society relations of all kinds, which is majorly enhanced, of course, by technological developments of one kind or another. Now, this, by the way, is why I think that the response to, say, current developments in China, the policy in Xinjiang, for example, should not be to move towards mercantilism and trade wars with China. Quite apart from the economic arguments against that, I think that is fundamentally mistaken in terms of the broader strategy I've just mentioned, because amongst other things, it would actually consolidate and strengthen the power and rule of the Chinese Communist Party, which is what you do not want to do in this context. The problem, I think, is that there has been a kind of rather naive view, a kind of economic determinism, a kind of inverted Marxism, I would call it, amongst too many liberals, to the effect that really a broadly free market economy is exactly the same thing as a free society. So that if you have a broadly free market economy, somehow by some kind of inevitable determinate process, you're going to end up with a liberal polity, liberal civil society, liberal government. And it's a bit like the kind of classical Marxism in which the material productive base determines everything else, the superstructure. And the evidence of China and of many other societies in the modern world is that that's clearly untrue. A broadly free economic system may be a necessary condition for a liberal and free society, but it's clearly not a sufficient condition. There are other things you need as well. And so the idea that just because China had moved very much in a capitalist direction, socialism with Chinese characteristics, or whatever the term is, that it would therefore develop all the other institutions of a liberal society, I think that was always naive. But what we should not do is react against that by reverting to a kind of Cold War strategy with regard to China, given that I do not think the Chinese regime is actually ideologically aggressive in the way that the Soviet Union was. It's not concerned to spread its own system of government. It just has much more traditional and conventional great power goals. The other subject, if I can quickly get on it very quickly, is that of, which is related to this, so is that of high tech and the whole world of social media, because at the moment we have a huge amount about the devastating effect that social media is having on, if you like, civil discourse in liberal modern societies. And people are increasingly alarmed about this. And I think the liberals have a particular perspective to bear on this, because I think a lot of the criticism is conflating two quite different points. One is an argument that the reason why we should be worried about Facebook and Instagram and Google is that they're monopolies. I'm very relaxed about that because I'm old enough to remember when IBM were going to take over the planet, and the experience and economics should tell us that actually very few monopolies that are not backed by government regulations are actually permanent. They're always subject to challenge. From that point of view, the worst thing we could have would be to have governments regulate companies like Google or Facebook as utilities, because that would almost certainly consolidate their position as monopolies, which is why they want it, I would add. However, I think there is a genuine problem which applies regardless of whether you have one Facebook or 20. And that is, I think, the way the algorithms work. And that's driven ultimately by their business model. But here I think you can provide a liberal insight, because what you have is a business model where income is driven by advertising, which in turn creates incentives to have as many clicks as possible, which creates incentives we all know about to have as many complete idiots as possible on the medium, so as to attract angry people responding to them. And I think that what you can do as a liberal is say, well, what you need to do here is to use the classic liberal institutions which minimize conflict and promote greater human sociability, which is, of course, property rights. And I think Jaron Lanier and Tim Berners-Lee, for example, both have interesting ideas about how you might do this to shift away from the current business model that social media have towards a different type of business model, one where income is not driven by things which lead you to create the algorithms that have these enormously socially destructive effects. And so I think that is an important issue where I think liberals can have a major contribution to make, while we can also tell people not to panic so much about monopoly.
Thank you. Emily, would you like to go next?
Sure. As someone who works at IHS, the Institute for Humane Studies, one of the things we really care about is the current state of the academy, and we're looking closely at the campus speech wars and trying to map out a more productive course forward than the illiberal responses that we're seeing at either extreme of the ideological spectrum. And I think in this case, liberalism really does offer us a course correction. And if you think about why that's the case and go back to Enlightenment era liberalism, it really is the foundation for the modern university, particularly in the American context, but in other places as well. You know, think about the liberal commitments to a genuine openness that, you know, we're going to follow truth wherever it may lead, a fearless willingness to challenge dogma and engage in a discovery process of trial and error and the contest of ideas. All of that is baked into the liberal tradition. Now, this liberal spirit of openness, this radical commitment to openness, is really the secret sauce that makes colleges and universities not only kind of special places to be and to work, but also a cornerstone of a free society. And if we lose that ethos, if we lose that respect for openness, we really lose the very idea of the university. Now, the good news, though, is that you know, despite the flashpoint kind of controversies that we hear, despite what's on what's, you know, the preferred narrative of a Fox News, I actually believe that most scholars have an abiding respect for the underlying liberal principles of the academy, that respect for the open and fearless exchange of ideas. But again, we need to remind ourselves that we have this compass called liberalism, that we have these values that underlie the academic community, but we need to dust that compass off. We need to point it in the right direction and help us get back on course to get back to the principles and the values that underlie the open university.
Thank you. And Chandran, we'll hear from you next.
So we've heard quite a lot, and it's difficult to add much to this because everyone's covered so many subjects so comprehensively. So I thought what I might do is say something a little bit more general about, I think, the dilemma that the liberal faces. And it's, in a way, the challenge that anyone of any ideological commitment faces, but it's especially one for liberals, given their particular suspicion of political power and power more generally. And that is the dilemma of the liberal who wants to bring about change, who wants to see some kind of improvement, even if not never-ending progress. What should the liberal do if in power? Now, it may be possible for some liberals to say, well, you know, politics is a dirty game, and indeed the exercise of power is always corrupting, which I think is true, and therefore I'm going to stay well out of it. And that may be okay up to a point, but it's not going to be a lot of use if all liberals turned out only to be theorists and not at all either activists or people who are in fact engaged in the business of exercising power or authority in a number of contexts, whether it's in local government or managing a university or indeed in going into political life. So the question then is, what does the liberal have to say about those who are exercising or about to exercise power? And to some extent, one could, of course, take the kind of view that Steve has advanced, which is the realist view that might be quite appropriate within a certain context, that is to say, in the context of international relations. But I don't think that this is the right way to go for a liberal who is, say, in the business of exercising power within something like a nation state. That's not the advice that I want to give to the President of the United States or the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom or to the House of Representatives or the Senate. I want to give them a quite different message, which is the message of restraint. That is to say, a very, very unrealistic kind of attitude that they ought to take. So in this regard, when it comes to, say, issues like free trade, I think Steve makes a very good point about the way in which we should think about relationships with China. But when looking at the issue from within the United States or from within Great Britain, the temptation as a political realist might be to say, well, you can't get into power and stay in there unless you play the game of politics and basically look out for your constituency, or in present circumstances especially, you play the nationalist card. I think here really what it behooves liberals to do is to offer a very different counsel, which is a counsel to essentially cleave to liberal principles, to be less realistic domestically, to wear the risk that comes with sticking to essentially liberal principles, whether they're liberal principles in the area of the market, or whether it's liberal principles in the area of the university, or it's liberal principles more generally when you're thinking about how you engage with people in a whole array of different contexts. I think that actually is something that's surprisingly difficult to do. The liberal philosophy, I think, is ultimately founded on a kind of principle of toleration. But I think we sometimes forget just how hard it is to tolerate difference. We're all, I think, somewhat inclined to say we will tolerate, but there are limits to toleration. And once we get to a certain point, well, we can no longer tolerate. But the problem with this view is that what it essentially ends up saying is that, well, I will tolerate the things I approve of, but not those things of which I disapprove. But this, in fact, ultimately goes against the very spirit of toleration. So I think the real challenge for liberals is that should they ever find themselves in power or find themselves having the ear of someone in power, is to keep counseling that they abide by liberal principles and not do that which is expedient, that which is politically necessary, even though this may, in fact, ultimately, or at least in the short term, mean conceding a certain amount of ground to your opponents or indeed to those whom you regard as highly illiberal. I think ultimately there isn't an illiberal way of being a liberal, and that is simply the price one has to accept if one is really going to be committed to liberal principles and liberal values.
Thank you. Well, we are running a little bit short on time. There are some questions from the audience, although I have to say that from what you've already said, you've actually answered some of them, so we can cut down the number. I do want to offer a couple, and then we'll have each of you briefly talk about what you see as the future of liberalism, if it has one. This is from Jack, a Duke sophomore, and I think we should give this to Steve Horowitz, given his background in monetary theory. Do you believe decentralized cryptocurrencies can help preserve free markets and protect civil liberties?
Okay, so a couple things I'll say about crypto. I think the most important thing and the most sort of the best thing about crypto from perspective of liberalism is that I think one of the paths forward for liberalism in practice is finding institutions and practices that work around the existing ways in which the state limits people's freedom. So another example of this, of course, is Uber, right? The story's a little complex there, but if you want to get around taxi cab regulations, come up with something new that enables you to circumvent them in ways that improve people's lives. And so I think crypto, one of the good things about crypto is that anything that offers us an alternative to the sort of state monopoly produced money, which is the source of a great deal of difficulties from a liberal perspective. I think in and of itself, that's a good thing. It's good when people have options. It's good as part of that process of discovering what people want, how they want to use it. It's also true that Bitcoin has the advantage of being anonymous. And so this enables people to engage in behaviors that we might think should be legal, but aren't. And sort of from a liberal perspective, that might be a good thing, although we certainly can imagine ways in which it would be used illiberally. So I think all those are good things. If the issue is, will Bitcoin and other cryptos become money and completely displace, say, the dollar, I don't think that's going to happen. And I don't think the sort of over promises that some devotees of crypto have made are helpful. But sort of from a broad liberal perspective, this is a cool, interesting innovation that provides people another set of choices when it comes to how they want to use money, enables them to engage in some things in private that they might wish to do. And I think those are all good things. And they're part of what I think one of the most important developments we've seen, and hopefully we'll continue to see, which is this development of alternative institutions to work around the ways in which that governments have prevented the liberal order from emerging.
Okay. Well, I think we will actually go right now to the final question, which is for each of you to talk a little bit about the future of liberalism. Emily, would you like to start us off?
Sure. On one level, the rising threat of illiberalism on both sides of the extremes of the ideological spectrum are incredibly troubling. This is not only right here at home, but just around the world. We ought to be very concerned about the rise of illiberal democracies, illiberal regimes around the country and around the globe, in places where we had thought that they were on a path to a liberal society. So this is very, very discouraging and concerning. At the same time, I also see a real opportunity here for reanimating the spirit of liberalism. In the United States, at least in the wake of the fall of the Berlin Wall, the end of the Cold War, there was a time in which it seemed that liberalism had kind of won the game, and so we stopped worrying about it. We stopped having to sort of defend it. It became the kind of ground beneath our feet that we just felt confident that was going to be there every morning when we woke up. And we didn't need, when you wake up in the morning, you don't need to think about whether that ground is going to be there to meet your feet in the morning. And so you stop wondering whether it's going to be there. I think that we've started to wake up to the fact that that ground is actually starting to crumble beneath our feet, and we need to fortify it. And so that's the thing that actually leads me to having an optimistic point of view. Ultimately, if we can do the cultural and intellectual work that is required to sustain liberalism, to reinforce liberal principles intellectually, and also as a kind of auto response that we want to see more of. And so, again, I want to be clear that it is absolutely essential to get the institutional rules of the game right with respect to a liberal constitutional order. But we also need to be, and I think this is where we've fallen off most precipitously, we also need to be capable and willing to champion a sort of liberal civic code that embraces and asserts liberalism's highest values, that commitment that we are one another's dignified equals, that we want to live in the good society, one that is defined by a kind of pluralistic ethos and a respect and a mutual respect. Those kinds of principles thrive. And these commitments that, are really what define what it means. If it becomes a cultural project, if we start to understand that it's these commitments that define what we mean by what it is to be a good neighbor, a good citizen, a good colleague, a good employer, a good parent. And that work is in part cultural, that we need to do that reinforcing with each other from the bottom up, right? And at the same time, it also is intellectual, because at times we might need to be called upon to explain our liberal intuition, and we need to be able to do a good job of why we go to that liberal compass to inform our moral intuitions, to inform what we're outraged about or what we care about, that we're able to unpack it and explain it if called upon to do so, so we can explain it to our kids, our neighbors, our colleagues, our fellow citizens. And that if we are called upon to do that, we feel compelled, we feel a duty to offer that explanation.
Great, thank you. Steve Davies, would you like to go next?
Well, hard to follow that. That was absolutely, spot on. I thought I agree with every word that Emily said there. I would say that the challenges that she mentions liberalism and liberals as facing at the moment, my own view is that in the future going forward, these are very much going to come from the right rather than the left. I think for the last 100 years, the major challenge to liberalism has come from the radical egalitarian left, the Jacobin or subsequently Bolshevik and socialist left. But I think that we're moving back into something like a 19th century politics in a strange sort of way, in which the major challenge to liberalism in country after country, we think of Turkey, India, many countries in Europe, the United States, the big challenge, I think, is actually coming from a new kind of right, a resurgent, or very old kind of right in some ways. And that's something to bear in mind, I think. And I think that she's absolutely right. What this should, and I believe will do, is to revitalize a kind of defense and articulation of fundamental liberal values across the board. Because what you see with people like, say, Viktor Orban here in Europe, the Prime Minister of Hungary, is a quite explicitly anti-liberal politics, which defines itself openly and overtly as being completely opposed to liberalism. And this isn't a case of saying, oh, we share the same ends, but we have different ideas about how to get there, which is the disagreement really between liberals and social democrats. It's a fundamental difference about what the good society is, what the nature of the human good is. And you can see this also with people like Patrick Deneen, for example, who would not deny that kind of charge. He's against liberalism to core. And so I agree with Chandran that this is the time to stick to principles and to articulate those principles clearly and forcibly and not compromise on them. And certainly, actually, the idea that this is incompatible with political success, I would actually deny and rebut. I think there's plenty of historical examples of people who have combined both political success and the articulation of liberal views of that kind. And also, I would say that this is a time to revive old ideas. I think one of the things that has happened to liberalism really in the course of the last 2/3 of the 20th century is that it's come to be dominated by economic liberalism, perhaps to the exclusion of other elements of the classic liberal approach, liberal sociology, other ideas of liberalism, other kinds of analytical approaches that liberalism has had. They've not been denied, they've just been forgotten about really, or relegated to the minor key. And I think it's time to actually revive a whole lot of liberal arguments, such as, for example, the ones for a liberal civic culture of the kind that Emily was talking about, which I think is enormously important. And what might make liberalism more persuasive, if you will? Well, I think that one of the things is that while the development of liberal ideas and arguments in the academy is vital, and while a functioning practical liberal politics and the articulation of those views by principal politicians is also vital, what both of those need to be grounded upon and based upon is a wider culture, if you will, of liberalism. And I think that one of the problems the academy has, regardless of your ideology actually, is that it's become increasingly separated from a wider intellectual culture because of developments in what the academy does. And also I think that we forget too often that for every person who's persuaded by a political speech or moved by reading a work of philosophy or the kind of stuff that all of us write, there are 100 people whose views are shaped and whose vision of the world is shaped by reading popular fiction, listening to music, looking at great works of art. And I think that there's a need, if you like, to revivify a self-consciously freedom-oriented, wider popular culture. And I think if that can be done, and I'm confident it can be done, I'm confident that actually we can win the argument and win the debate that we've clearly got to re-engage in.
Thank you. Chandran?
It's the question about whether liberalism has a future does depend a little bit on what is the time frame one's considering. So I have no predictions to make about the next 1,000 or 2,000 years, just given all the things that we've seen happen in human history. I've no doubt that lots of different ideas and movements and traditions will emerge and die and meld. I have no particular skill as a prognosticator. But all that said, I think it's also fair to say that there are some continuities in human experience, to the extent that we all need certain sorts of things in order to flourish. We need relationships, friendships, families. We need to be economically secure. We need to have a certain kind of background environment, and we all do worse if we live under tyrannical regimes or under economic systems that simply don't work. To quote Richard Feynman, or paraphrase him, and he said that nature will not be fooled. I think it's equally true that, in a sense, society cannot be fooled, at least not forever. So going a distance into the future, it may well be the case that new ideas, new traditions, new ways of conceiving things emerge. I think it's also likely to be the case that some of the basic liberal truths and insights will remain. They may not be called liberal. There may be other terminology or other configurations, but in the end, I think people will simply be forced to recognize that they cannot control social forces, that if they try to interfere with the way that people wish to live, that there will be a reaction to this, that people who act tyrannically will ultimately be overthrown, although one cannot be sure how quickly or how much damage that they might do. To the extent that all these things are true, I think the liberal impulse will always be there. There will always be sources of resistance to political and other forms of social power. Looking back at the question a little less further into the future, though, I think the challenge that I think liberals need to contend with, among many of the others that have been raised already, is the question of nationalism. I think we're actually living in the middle of a period when the nation state, the state, has come to prominence, has come to exercise a measure of control that's really quite extraordinary. I've made this point already, but it also relies for its success on a kind of willingness on the part of the population, not just to accept its authority, which has always been the issue or the problem for political regimes, but it's also got to have people accepting the extent of its authority, the reach of its power. And I think the most persuasive narrative it's got to date to tell people that this is right and this is legitimate, this is valuable, is the nationalist narrative. And it is essentially a tribal narrative. It's an argument that says, we're all in this together and there is a we, and this is who we are. And you should start thinking about your well-being in terms of the well-being of the collective. Now, the argument that's being put here is essentially going to be an argument that's anti-individualist, and individualism will become a bad word because the suggestion will be that individualism means selfishness, indifference to others, an absence of community, a lack of respect for tradition. This will be the narrative that's presented in order to secure the power of those who are wielding it. And it's a very seductive narrative because people like to think that they're part of something and to share in a measure of greatness. I think what's very important for liberals to try to do is to disabuse people of this, not by saying that it's only the individual that matters, but it is to say that the individual and his or her life is not enhanced by this form of membership, by this particular form of collectivity. Of course, we need to be in association with others. We cannot live alone. We cannot flourish alone. But this does not translate into the conclusion that being a part of this larger entity that is the political order of the nation state, it is not the case that this is what's either necessary or sufficient for our flourishing. Indeed, I think I would go further and to say it's positively damaging to human flourishing in so many ways, at the very least, because what it does is sacrifice some portion of the community to the advantage of another. And I think making people aware of this, of the extent to which when arguments are made for our membership, our participation in, our belonging to the state, what's so important is to disabuse them of that particular commitment. America first, Britain first, Australia first, all of these things are the things I think that most need to be resisted, but they're also the most difficult things to get people to see.
Thank you. Steve Horowitz, will you finish off then?
Yeah, let me start by saying, first of all, as an economist, I heartily endorse Steve Davies' call for liberal sociology, liberal history, liberal, all of them. And I think that's really important, as is the role of culture that both he and Emily stress. So I'll conclude briefly by saying I think that we need to remember something Hayek said about how the liberal movement would have to continue to reinvent and reimagine itself every generation. We're in a position, I think, uniquely problematic position, as Emily said, where three things are true. Liberalism is on the run in terms of policies in a way it's perhaps never been in at least the US before. It's on the run in the world of ideas in a way it perhaps hasn't been in a long time. And it's on the run in, as both Steve and Chandran said, in a very explicitly anti-liberal way. And that's an important difference, I think, as also Emily points out as well. We can't take it for granted anymore. So I think one of the things we have to do is to restate, to deepen, to broaden the world of liberal ideas in ways that speak to younger people and the concerns that they have. There's just no moving forward for liberalism if we can't be part of the conversation about things like social justice, about the issues raised by Black Lives Matter, about one thing we didn't talk about today was climate change, but about climate change, about all the kinds of things that are at the forefront of young people's issues of sexuality, for example, that are at the forefront of young people's concerns today. And we have to do that. If we can't do that, we will have lost a generation of young people. And I think that is really damaging for the future of liberalism. I am, if I'm not the most optimistic person I know, I'm not sure who is, but so I'm always sort of fueled by that optimism, and always have been with respect to the world of ideas. But this is a particularly challenging time for the reasons that all of us, I think, have articulated. And there's lots of things we need to do, but high on the list is reimagining and restating and deepening the set of liberal ideas in ways that speak to the concerns of young people, of people of color, of immigrants, of all the rest, in ways that we can and we have, but we just have to find to better language, better ideas that can speak to them now. Otherwise, I think, again, we'll have lost a generation, and that will be a major problem.
Listen, this has been a wonderful discussion. I want to thank all of you for your contributions. I look forward to getting reactions from my students when they see this, and hopefully we'll get it out there so that between this panel and the other two panels, some good discussions will get going on the future of all of these doctrines. So thank you once again for joining us.
Thank you,
Thank you for
Bruce.
having me.
Thank you, everybody.